What struck me first, that perhaps didn't come across because I read your booklet that was circulated, was the issue about language. So what do we mean when we talk about evidence? So scientific evidence for me just switches me off, if I'm honest, even though I'm a kind of scientist by training. I did science A-levels and I shouldn't have done, and started doing pharmacology and biochemistry as a degree and realised I shouldn't be doing that either. So switched to psychology because it implies a narrowness, whereas actually what you were talking about was much richer than that. It was about curiosity, it was about questioning, it was about how do we have organisations where actually that's valued as much as the doing, because actually the doing is richer for the questioning and so I think there's something for me always actually about language. And so as chief exec of a local authority, if you put me in a room, you know, with different sort of sectors, when we talk about evidence, we'll be talking about different things. And so one of the biggest challenges I think collectively for all of us, not just in public service but in places, is that we know the way that we've been working hasn't delivered the change that we really wanted it to. That's not to say that everything's failed, but if I look at Oldham, you know, we still have some of the worst deprivation of anywhere in the country. Recently we got the worst city in the country ONS report, which was true for some metrics, but the same, you know, always with these reports, they're not completely true. And yet we've had billions of money, you know, pounds of money coming in. We've had all kinds, if there was a special programme to deal with deprivation, it's happened in Oldham. And yet we just haven't seen the change. And that's not to say that people haven't changed their life experience, but they may well have moved out of Oldham. For some people it absolutely hasn't. So how do we startle everybody's thinking? How do we bring different kind of perspectives and ideas into the work that we do, the managing, and that professionalism of management in a way that just isn't currently there, I don't think, because we've been pushed down a certain route around targets and metrics and being rewarded for that kind of thing. So I'm very, very clear as Chief Exec of Oldham Council, I have no idea what Oldham Council will look like in 5 years' time. And I'm honest about that in the organisation, but that's quite a challenging thing to do. Now, partly I don't know because I don't know what is going to happen in Greater Manchester in terms of devolution and what that may or may not mean for local government reorganisation, but also that I don't know what it means in terms of the reducing central government support for local government. I don't know what services may or may not be under the aegis of local government in the future, or maybe under the NHS or somewhere else. I don't know what a directly elected mayor is going to mean. You know, so there's lots of things that I just don't know. But what I do know is that we've got some real challenges facing us that we have to find solutions to. So the focus on some of that. So actually, I'm pretty clear on some of the questions to be posed. And so that very much more adaptive leadership space, rather than saying, actually, I can take 20 million out of the budget, I can do that. I'm going to have to do it again. It'll be the third year that I've had to do it. So it's a technical issue. So part of the thing for me that was really important in what Rob was saying was about the framing of the problem, because we leap into solution and look for evidence because we've made assumptions about what the problem was in the first place. And that's the bit I think when you look at commissioning cycles, procurement, all these kind of things, we really, really haven't understood what the problem is that we're looking to kind of address. So that's one of the really important things for me. The other thing that strikes me, and you perhaps expect me to address this as somebody working in a political system, is I think it's a false dichotomy to set politicians and managers up. We absolutely, in the ethos of Oldham Council, see that we bring different skills to the decision-making process. So it's not a hierarchical in terms of, but it's equally not about the profession saying, I've absolutely got the experience, I've been a social worker for 30 years, I understand the legislation, I know the risks, members, you must make this decision. It's recognising that we bring that part to the decision-making process. Equally valid, equally as much as evidence, is the political ethos, is the understanding of the consequences of those decisions on the lived experience of the population in the area. And actually, if you don't take those two things together, you have a significantly weaker decision than you would if you brought those two things together. The other bit for me, I think, is then, so in the literature around kind of evidence-based management in a democratically accountable system is significantly under-researched, I think, and underdeveloped. And by democratically accountable, again, I don't just mean a political system. If you look at the thousands of governors that we have, the thousands of non-exec directors, we have all sorts of democratically accountable systems, and we significantly underplay the leadership role of those people in those kind of roles. We may, if we're lucky, look at elected members. maybe bring MPs in that, but we don't consistently look at that broader democratically accountable system and the resource that that brings into play, but also the valuing, the kind of parity of esteem really between professional experience and work experience and lived experience. And you begin to see it in the NHS, don't you? And you begin to see it in policing as well, in terms of the Victims Commissioner and the voice of the victim throughout the system, through expert patient types of things, but it's around the margins, it's ad hoc. And so actually as managers, my view is you absolutely have to understand those kind of perspectives. I spend as much time out with my workforce and in the communities in Oldham talking to people, quite often very angry people actually, about those kind of issues, because there's a huge public service determinism for outcomes. We know somebody's surname, we know their address, we make assumptions. It's back to the blink. You know, we've made a decision about their likely life outcome before we've even met them, actually. And so some of this for me then about what Rob was saying about pause, actually. What trusted sources are you looking at? Where are you getting your evidence and your information from? How rich is that, or how narrow is that? And how much does it just reinforce the current orthodoxy, or how much does it help you change it and challenge it? So for me, I have a DCS, Director of Children's Services, as you would expect as a local authority. And she does not have line management responsibility for education. She does not have line management responsibility for the multi-agency safeguarding hub. And there's really good reasons for that. But if I looked for evidence for that model, there is none, because nobody else has that model. And so when we got the call on the Friday for Ofsted coming on the Monday, I was thinking, oh shit, maybe I shouldn't have that model either, because Ofsted will just hate this. But actually, because of the evidence and the case that we could make about, actually, I needed to separate the safeguarding hub from the DCS because I needed to challenge the social work culture. But not only that, I needed to bring safeguarding much more into community development and the way that we work with communities, that it wasn't just something that we did once somebody was seen as at risk or had become a victim. There was a really strong logic to that. And also that early years education was part of improving the competitiveness of Oldham residents and Oldham young people. And that's why it was in the kind of Economy and Skills Directorate. We could make a really good case for it. But if I just looked at the kind of the current orthodoxy and the literature and the evidence, I wouldn't, you know, it would all have pushed me to staying with the status quo. So there is something for us, isn't there, about evidence as making the case for change, but the push of evidence that is just really about reinforcing where we already are. And so how do we startle that? The other bit for me then, I think, is about something, I did an MA in literature, so I've kept my kind of academic just quite a lot of time for personal interest, and we are very narrow about where we learn from. So I don't know of many local authorities that access academic databases as a matter of course, and yet why not? You know, because if you're doing any kind of study, you go on, you look at JSTOR, you go through Athens, you pick up, you just do a literature review. We don't do that in local government, actually. We look at what other councils are doing. We maybe look at international examples, but we look within our own kind of frame of reference already. People like us, doing stuff like us, what can we learn from them? Rather than thinking of that kind of, in literature, you talk about intertextuality, so learning from something completely different and applying it to a completely bizarre context it might look like, actually really kind of sparks that difference and that different kind of perspective. So how do we bring some of that into, so my MA final dissertation was around a narrative construction of masculinity in turn of the century imperialist romances. I was really interested in it, nobody else was. Actually, what I learned from that actually was how much our organisations are narratively constructed, that they don't exist in lots of real senses. They only exist through the stories that we tell ourselves and tell each other. So lots of really kind of, not that when I go, this is really interesting, and people at work, I'm not allowed to share an office with anybody now, I have to sit on my own because they didn't find it particularly interesting. But actually, when you then started looking at the way that we engaged with people, actually, people engage through stories. They have things that they want to share, they want to tell. And so let's use that as one of our main things. And actually, how do you change the narrative of an organisation if you're not engaging with those stories in the first place? It's impossible to do it. It doesn't matter what kind of policy or framework I set out as head of the organisation. People make their judgments at the point of implementation, and they'll take those things on board. So I could say lots more, that it was fascinating and poses all kinds of challenges for us, I think, in terms of how do we have, you know, really curious and kind of questioning managers who are prepared to take those risks. And some of that's about the shared leadership responsibility of absolutely not chopping their heads off when it goes wrong. I've learnt more at every point in my career from the things that didn't go very well, much more than those things that, you know, absolutely did. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.